When it comes to security, embassies don't mess around. After all, embassies in hostile countries are often armed to the nines and will stop at nothing to defend against potential threats. Here are the top 15 most secure embassies on Earth. Number 15. America's Pakistani Embassy. The United States tends to build highly secure embassies in unstable places, and the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad, Pakistan certainly fits the bill. That's because as far as defenses go, the compound is pretty impeccable. First of all, the compound itself has 2 sets of walls before you get to the actual building, ensuring that assailants will have a difficult time getting in. If you decide to drive into the embassy, then you have to contend with several speed bumps, zigzag barriers, guard posts, and metal sheets that can be raised to impale a car in seconds. These all help ensure the embassy's safety during an attack. However, these were only really deemed necessary after a major assault in 1979. That's because it was this year that it was attacked by Islamic protesters after they falsely heard that the U.S. had attacked a mosque, and this led to the entire thing burning to the ground. As a result, the latest rebuild of the embassy is far sturdier and much more secure. Number 14. Myanmar's Thai Embassy. While Myanmar's Thai Embassy may be located in a pretty busy area, its large walls and barbed wire ensure that no intruders can get in. And while this may seem like overkill, the reasons for this are rooted in an incident in 1999. That's because it was in this year that a group of Burmese dissidents from the vigorous Burmese student warriors stormed the Burmese embassy and held 89 people hostage. Their goal was to force negotiations to be opened between the National League for Democracy and the Myanmar government, as they were tired of the authoritarian rule in their country. And while these demands were not met, the Thai authorities simply allowed them to go back to Myanmar untried, as they chose to view them as student protesters rather than terrorists. Regardless, this episode caused Myanmar to really beef up security across its embassies, with the Thailand embassy in particular being the recipient of strong amounts of security upgrades. Number 13. Russia's Irish Embassy. Although it's still under construction, Russia's new Irish embassy has been the source of a lot of recent concern. Located in South Dublin, the walled compound has been flagged by Irish security services as potentially being a Russian listening post to detect data from across the EU. The thought process behind this is that because Ireland is part of NATO, it was easy for Russia to build up a base there, as the security infrastructure Ireland has in place just wasn't as robust as that of a NATO country. This would be problematic as it would give Russia easier access to European radio waves, and thus could pose a problem for the integrity of EU security. Unsurprisingly, Russia has denied the allegations and has gone as far as to accuse Irish authorities of, quote, playing games by stalling the construction efforts. On our end, we're just curious to see if the rest of the EU will see this new embassy as a threat and step up to intervene. Number 12. Israel's Argentina Embassy. Israel has certainly gotten into more than its fair share of scuffles with the Muslim-majority countries, and this has made its security needs larger than most countries of its size. Yet of all the embassies it has to keep a special eye on its Buenos Aires embassy in Argentina. That's because on March 17th of 1992, a pickup truck driven by a suicide bomber and loaded with explosives smashed into the front of the Israeli embassy. While it killed just 4 Israeli citizens, it killed a further 29 Argentinians and was largely considered to be the worst terrorist attack in Argentine history. A group called the Islamic Jihad Organization, which has been linked to Iran and possibly Hezbollah, claimed responsibility for the atrocity, with their stated motive for the attack being Israel's assassination of Hezbollah's Secretary General Saeed Abbas al-Musawi in February 1992. Thus, while Argentina may not seem to be at odds with Israel, ever since that country has had to amp up its embassy security there. Number 11. America's Dutch Embassy. While embassies are often beautifully built to represent the character of a nation, America's Dutch Embassy goes against the grain. Constructed in 2018 in the city of Wassenaar, it essentially looks like a massive prison, complete with fences and guards around it. Officially made to provide, quote, a secure, modern, and environmentally sustainable platform for diplomacy in the Netherlands, end quote, it certainly is somewhere that could easily fend off a terrorist attack. Interestingly enough, the old building was sold off to a private buyer, who many hope would repurpose it into a hotel of some sort. Regardless, America's new Wassenaar Embassy will likely remain in service for decades to come. Number 10. China's Australian Consulate. China is by all accounts an up-and-coming superpower, and like many nations, it has begun to spread its embassies and consulates abroad. Yet out of all of them, their consulate in Adelaide is quite fascinating. Completed in March of 2021, it is bristling with cameras and sensors despite being located in a quiet Australian residential suburb. As a result, many locals are suspicious that it's there to try to obtain defense secrets. Due to the fact that Adelaide is a hub for the nation's naval and submarine re-equipment program that has been spurred because of China's military buildup, many are questioning why the Chinese were allowed to take up residence there. This decision has been especially strange, since most embassies are located in the capital city of Canberra, and if consulates are located elsewhere, they're usually small and low-key. This is in stark contrast to this new South Australian facility, which is surrounded by 3-meter-high security walls, a sentry box, floodlights and movement sensors, and high-tech cameras. Therefore, it may not be long until China is asked to relocate to another area of the country. In the Middle Ages, many forts would have moats around them in order to defend themselves from attacks. And while those mostly fell to the wayside after the invention of gunpowder, in 2018 the United States decided to surround their London embassy with one as a counter-terrorism measure. Now, the embassy, which came at a price of over $1 billion, was designed by Philadelphia-based architect James Timberlake. Shaped like a massive glass cube, the building itself doesn't scream high security, but this is reportedly countered by the moat on the perimeter. Apparently built because Timberlake didn't want to install security measures like high walls and a defensive perimeter around the embassy. He instead opted to build a 30-meter by 150-meter half-moon strip of water in front of the building in order to protect it from attack. He then complemented the moat with other protections such as triple-glazed and blast-proof glass walls, both raised and sunken trenches instead of a wire fence, and a Faraday cage made of conductive material to prevent electronic eavesdropping, and of course a contingent of soldiers on duty. Therefore, while it may look pretty unassuming, the embassy is actually very well fortified. Number 7. China's American Consulate. As relations between the US and China continue to sour, embassies have often been on the chopping block. That's because across the United States there are several highly secured Chinese embassies and consulates that are believed to be centers of espionage. According to a report by the renowned international relations journal Foreign Policy in July of 2020, a State Department spokesperson told them that, quote, "The People's Republic of China has engaged for years in massive illegal spying and influence operations throughout the United States against U.S. government officials and American citizens. These activities have increased markedly in scale and scope over the past few years," end quote. As a result, the State Department announced in July of 2020 that it would close China's consulate in Houston, Texas, after local authorities in Houston responded to reports of fires at this consulate, with witnesses reporting that its employees were burning files in trash cans. And while this may or may not be true, it certainly may lead to more consulate closures in both the United States and China in the near future. Number 6. The Quantico Headquarters. Generally speaking, soldiers are tasked with defending their nation's embassies abroad, and while most soldiers would simply be sent off to where they have to go, in the United States things are done a little differently. That's because if a Marine wants to have the privilege of protecting an embassy abroad, they must have been specially selected and trained by the Marine Corps Embassy Security Group at their headquarters in Quantico, Virginia. As it currently stands, Marines who are selected to participate in the program receive 8 weeks of training in preparation for 3 separate 12-month tours overseas. Much of the training that goes on there is top secret, but what we do know is that there are programs meant to prepare soldiers to defend an embassy, not just against terrorist threats, but also against protests, crime, and natural disasters. They even learn how to properly guard top-level politicians being escorted on diplomatic missions, thus allowing them to be useful in all types of situations. Therefore, while this headquarters may not be an embassy itself, we think it deserved a spot due to its critical role in protecting the plethora of American embassies on this list. Number 5. America's Iraqi Embassy. While the United States has stuck its nose into the affairs of countless countries, Iraq stands apart for being the most infamous. After all, ever since the U.S. Army entered the country in 2003, the embassy has been the constant target of attacks, and this has led to a massive reconstruction effort that was completed in late 2007. While most of the details are still a secret, even just the basic outline of the compound is astounding. Coming in at an upgrade cost of $600 million and a yearly operating cost of $1.2 billion, it's both the largest and most expensive embassy in the world. In terms of size, it's a walled embassy that's approximate size of the Vatican City, and it contains 21 reinforced buildings, along with half a square kilometer block on the Tigris River. The perimeter walls are about 3 meters high and are made of reinforced concrete that's strong enough to protect against mortars, rockets, and car bombs. This perimeter is surrounded by a free fire zone and can only be accessed via 5 defensible entrance gates and a special emergency gate. To top this off, there's even a helipad atop of it, allowing for an escape route should things get specifically shaky. Now, the embassy was supposed to be absolutely impregnable. In fact, the American government even went to great lengths to ensure that locals would not know about its interior, as all the workers for the project came from countries such as Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. Yet this didn't stop protests from erupting outside of it, as locals showed up in droves and even breached the perimeter walls in protest against American airstrikes on civilian targets in late 2019. This situation even escalated to full-out rocket assaults in early 2020, with one actually hitting the cafeteria. Thus, it's clear that despite their protections, the Baghdad embassy is still a dangerous place. Number 4. Japan's Peruvian Embassy. When we think of nations that are at odds with each other, rivalries such as that between the United States and China, the United States and Russia, and Israel and Palestine come to mind. However, you may be surprised to hear that Japan and Peru's relationship used to be on rocky waters, and as a result, it's heavily fortified with large guard towers on every corner. Why, you may ask? Well, it turns out that on December 17th of 1996, 14 members of the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, or MRTA, took hundreds of high-level diplomats, government officials, military leaders, and business executives as hostages while they were attending a party at the official residence of the Japanese ambassador to Peru. While all the female attendees were let go after one night, and a few more in the next few weeks, a large chunk were trapped until April 22nd of 1997. In return for the hostages' release, the rebels made several demands, with these including the release of their members from Peru's prisons, a revision of Peru's neoliberal fiscal policies, and reforms to the country's prison system. For a time, it looked like they would get some of what they wanted, and the president of Peru went so far as to look for a country that would be willing to take the rebels as exiles. Yet rather than go through with this plan, a Peruvian commando mission known as Operation Chaven de Huantar successfully raided the ambassador's house, where they killed all the militants while sustaining just 2 commando deaths and 1 diplomat death. Quite a bit of controversy was stirred up directly afterwards, as it emerged that many of the rebels were summarily killed after they surrendered. Regardless, all of those put on trial for killing the rebels were exonerated of all charges, and ever since, the Japanese embassy in Peru has ensured that it's armed to the nines at all times. Number 3. America's Afghanistan Embassy. The United States and Afghanistan relationship can be classified as being extremely unstable, and as such, the American embassy in the country is amongst the most fortified in the world. Located in the capital city of Kabul, it ensures the security of those inside by having several layers of protection. The perimeter walls are manned by Afghan security forces, who make up the section as part of their duty to the embassy as a host nation. Further layers of the compound consist of more robust security, with several checkpoints being in place to both identify and slow down potential threats. In fact, there are even walls that can be brought up in order to tear an approaching car in half. And there are mandatory background checks on all who enter the building. As such, most would agree that the embassy is as safe as can be. However, this doesn't mean that it hasn't been subject to some pretty frequent attacks. After all, groups such as the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are constantly looking for ways to undermine the American presence in the country, and they do so by wreaking havoc on the embassy. To give some examples, on September 13th of 2011, a suicide bomber made a go at the building. Then, on April 15th of 2012, Afghan security forces had to fight off a full-fledged assault. And even later, on September 11th of 2019, a rocket was launched at the complex. Thus, given its track record, it's safe to say that the heavy defenses at the embassy are warranted. Number 2. Switzerland's Iranian Embassy. Generally speaking, an embassy will only represent one country. However, in the case of the Swiss embassy in Iran, they have to work overtime due to it representing both the United States and a host of other nations. Located in Tehran, it's surrounded by large walls and a massive security force, which ensures that no threats enter the compound. Yet the reason why it's also home to the United States can be traced back to 1979. That's because it was in this year that both the Iranian Revolution and the Iranian hostage crisis took place. More specifically, on November 5th of 1979, 52 American diplomats and citizens were taken hostage after a group of militarized Iranian college students belonging to the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line invaded the embassy. The hostages were held for 444 days in both the embassy and in several prisons around Iran. While the provisional government was still in place, they were reportedly treated quite well, but their conditions got considerably worse once it fell. Put simply, these conditions got so bad that they were practically treated like dogs, as they were chained in cold and dark rooms, systematically tortured, and were repeatedly denied the right to move, clean themselves, or even talk to each other for weeks on end. This led to an attempt by the U.S. government to save the hostages. Yet once it failed, they resorted to negotiations. These were finally completed on January 19th of 1981 with the Algiers Accords. And as a part of this agreement, the United States agreed to both stop intervening in Iranian affairs, unfreeze Iranian assets, and remove trade sanctions. And while much of this proved only temporary, it's not hard to see why it has made it necessary for American diplomats to stay confined to the walls of Switzerland's embassy. Number 1. The Tanzanian and Kenyan Embassies. Sometimes countries have to learn things the hard way, and this was certainly the case in 1998, when the United States had both its Tanzanian and Kenyan embassies attacked. Occurring on August 7th of 1998, the simple explanation of the matter was that more than 200 people were killed in 2 truck bomb explosions at both the American Embassy in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and the American Embassy in Nairobi, Kenya. While the attacks were linked to the local Islamist jihad, the entire thing was orchestrated by Al-Qaeda. Their supposed motivation was that they wanted revenge for U.S. involvement in the extradition and alleged torture of 4 Islamic jihadists who had been arrested in Albania 2 months prior, and this led them to make some pretty horrific plans. More specifically, they created the Kenyan bomb out of 400 to 500 cylinders of TNT, ammonium nitrate, aluminum powder, and a detonating cord, and made the Tanzanian bomb by attaching TNT to 15 oxygen tanks and gas canisters and 4 bags of ammonium nitrate fertilizer. Once detonated, they took a combined total of 224 lives and caused large parts of the embassies to fall down. In response to the bombings, President Bill Clinton ordered Operation Infinite Reach, which is a series of cruise missile strikes on targets in Sudan and Afghanistan. He also allowed for arrest warrants to be issued for all the terrorists involved, and ever since, almost every single one has been killed or imprisoned. Nowadays, relations between Kenya, Tanzania, and the United States have become much smoother, but in order to make sure that a stunt will never happen again, these embassies are now armed to the teeth with many levels of security. Watch our binge-watching playlist if you'd like to watch all of our most popular top 15 videos. Grab a drink, grab a snack, and get ready to binge.